After being abruptly stopped late at night in Dallas in 1993, Chuck Norris was found to be being held at gunpoint by a robbed policeman. What began as a terrible encounter turned into a sinister conspiracy, and the officer was imprisoned shortly after. This horrific occurrence represented a turning point in Norris's life, exposing a more profound aspect of his humanity and resiliency. Chuck Norris, who was only 53 at the time, was driving his black Ford Mustang through the dark streets of Dallas on a chilly November evening in 1993. The city was silent under the cloudy sky, and as he came home from dinner with close friends, he had no idea that this seemingly ordinary drive would forever alter his life. Suddenly, red and blue lights burst forth behind him. As he reached for his registration, Chuck noticed the officer approaching unusually quickly. Before Chuck could say anything, the officer drew his gun and pointed it directly at him, his voice cold and commanding that he get out of the car. Chuck was surprised but calm, and he pulled over to the side of the road on Preston Road, a stretch known for its upscale homes and inhibition at night. The officer then barked. Chuck was clearly startled, but cooperative opened the door gently and stepped outside with his hands up. He could feel the tension in the air, his heartbeat drowning out the distant sound of cars. "Is something wrong, sir?" Chuck's voice remained steady as he asked, but the officer didn't respond. Instead, he made an aggressive gesture with his gun and told Chuck to kneel on the pavement. For a brief moment, the world around him seemed to dim, and memories of his late father, who had abandoned his family years ago, flashed before his eyes. The familiar feeling of abandonment returned, but this time it was accompanied by something new and dreadful, and Chuck was unaware that this officer had a history of misbehavior. A young mother had complained a few weeks prior that the officer had threatened her during a routine traffic stop, but he managed to stay on duty. Tonight, Chuck was his latest target. As the minutes passed, the officer started questioning him aggressively, accusing him of being drunk. Chuck would hardly touch alcohol all night, maintaining his innocence and calm demeanor, which was evidence of the quiet strength he was known for. Then, as if the universe intervened, a second patrol car arrived, and a younger officer stepped out instantly, recognizing Chuck Norris. The tension briefly subsided, but it was enough for the new officer to notice something was amiss, so he demanded to see what was going on. I believe there was a misunderstanding, since Chuck was still kneeling on the ground when he finally exhaled. His voice was filled with a mixture of relief and terror. The younger officer nodded and motioned for him to stand. What transpired was a rapid investigation. The rogue officer's history of abuse came to light, and within weeks he was not only stripped of his badge, but also jailed for misconduct. The media caught wind of the story, painting Chuck as a victim of an unjust system, but Chuck never sought revenge or retribution. Instead, he used the experience to reflect on the fragility of life and the importance of staying grounded even in moments of chaos. What haunted him most, however, wasn't the gun or the officer's accusations. It was the thought of how quickly things could have escalated. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and he might not have lived to tell the tale. And yet, in typical Chuck fashion, he chose to move forward with quiet grace, his life forever altered by the events of that November night. But this story doesn't end there. It was only the beginning of a chapter in Chuck's life that revealed not just the cracks in the system, but also the resilience of a man who had already endured so much as the years went on. Chuck would come to see this moment as a turning point, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always a way to rise above. And little did he know this encounter would lead to a connection that would forever change his path. Even though the rogue cop was swiftly brought to justice, Chuck Norris's weeks following that terrifying night seemed to fly by, and the emotional toll of the experience still weighed heavily on him at his small house on the outskirts of Dallas. Chuck had always been an introspective man who kept his feelings to himself, but this experience had left him with an irrevocable impression of how quickly everything could be taken away. He spent his nights staring at the Dallas skyline, the city lights flickering like stars just out of reach. Chuck found himself thinking about the frailty of life, not just the moment the gun had been pointed at him. Even though his fame kept growing, Mark felt more and more cut off from the glamorous world of Hollywood, the parties, the premieres. It all felt hollow. One of those quiet nights, a letter from Emma Walters, a San Antonio nurse, arrived at his door. She had heard about the incident on the news and felt compelled to write to him. Her words were straightforward, but incredibly moving. She told his own story of surviving a traumatic event, a car accident that left her bedridden for months, and how she had found comfort in watching his films while she recovered. "When I didn't think I could continue on, your movies offered me hope," she wrote. "I wanted to express my gratitude for being a beacon of light during a difficult period." Chuck was moved by her honesty and spent hours reading the letter. He didn't often reply to fan mail, but something in Emma's words moved him. So that evening he wrote back a heartfelt note, thanking her for her courage and explaining how her words had given him perspective during one of the most trying times in his life. He sent the letter without expecting a response, but Emma did. What started out as a straightforward letter exchange swiftly turned into a relationship neither of them had expected, with them writing to each other every week to share their thoughts, fears, and dreams. Emma shared with Chuck how the ocean had always been her haven while she was growing up on the shore. As months went by, their correspondence deepened into something that felt both fragile and profound. Chuck then opened up about his struggles with loss, including his father's abandonment, the passing of his best friend Bruce Lee, and the weight of being thrust into the spotlight at such a young age. Chuck, who was known for being guarded, found himself lowering his walls in a way that he hadn't in years. One evening, as spring warmed the Texas air, Emma became a lifeline for Chuck, a reminder that even in the most difficult times, human connection could provide comfort through beauty and vulnerability. Chuck made the decision to visit Emma in San Antonio. Thinking she might tell him not to come, he didn't call in advance and instead showed up at the small coffee shop where she volunteered on the weekends. Emma gasped when she saw him standing in the doorway because she had seen his face countless times on movie posters and screens. But in that instant, he was just Chuck. A man whose eyes were heavy with all they had discussed said, "Hello." He began in a calm, quiet voice. Emma was too stunned to say anything more than nod. They sat by the window, the sound of conversation filling the silence between them. Although they didn't say much that day, there was an unspoken understanding. Between them, a recognition of two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of ways. Their story didn't unfold like a Hollywood romance, with no dramatic declarations of love or grand gestures. Rather, it was in the quiet moments when they spent long drives to visit and spent nights talking until dawn. For the first time in years, Chuck felt at peace, and Emma, who had dedicated so much of her life to caring for others, had found someone who accepted her for who she really was. However, life, as Chuck had discovered, is never without its challenges. As their relationship blossomed, an unforeseen obstacle arose that would test their bond and force them to face the pain of their pasts. For Chuck, it served as a reminder that love, like life, is rarely simple. But in Emma, he had found something worth fighting for, and so their story continued on a journey of healing resilience and the quiet strength that comes from finding someone who understands the depths of your soul. As the days turned into weeks, Chuck and Emma's bond deepened like two rivers quietly merging into one. Their connection was simple yet complex, with people who had been damaged by life finding comfort in each other's company. Chuck, who had spent years silently carrying his grief, felt lighter when he was with her. Emma, who had learned to endure her pain alone, discovered a rare sense of safety in his quiet strength, but love, as they both knew, wasn't just about the good moments. It was about facing the storms together, and theirs was approaching faster than either of them could have imagined. One late evening, while sitting on the porch of Emma's small home, Chuck noticed her rubbing her wrist absent-mindedly. It wasn't the first time he'd seen her wrist, but she always brushed it off with a soft smile and an excuse about an old injury acting up this time. Though he pressed Emma, he said gently, his voice filled with concern, "You've been doing that a lot lately. What's going on?" Her smile faltered, and for a moment she looked as though she might deflect again, but something about the way Chuck's eyes searched hers, so sincere, so patient, made her pause. "It's nothing really," she began, her voice trembling, just residual pain from the accident. "Some days are worse than others." "Emma," Chuck murmured softly, "you don't have to carry this alone, whatever it is. I'm here." He grabbed for her hand and held it delicately, as though it could shatter beneath his touch. Her eyes filled with tears, and she eventually allowed the walls she had constructed to collapse. My voice is barely above a whisper, and I sometimes can't even hold a pen without it slipping from my fingers. I've been trying to ignore it, in the hopes that it will go away, but it's been growing worse. I've been having these episodes. Chuck felt his chest constrict. He had experienced loss before the gut-wrenching. "I didn't want to worry anyone, and honestly, I'm scared, Chuck. What if it's something serious?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and the sound of nearby conversations filled the silence between them. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," he whispered, firm with quiet determination. "You don't have to be AF." It was a heartbreaking loss. But the thought of Emma going through this in silence made his heart ache and made him feel something he had never felt before. "Have you seen a doctor?" "I'm afraid no more." The following morning, Chuck took Emma to see a neurologist in Dallas while closely clutching her hand. The office was quiet and clean, and the hum of fluorescent lights added to the anxiety while Emma went through a battery of tests. Chuck anxiously waited in the foyer, imagining the worst-case situations. Hours later, the doctor summoned them to his office. His expression was solemn, and Emma's hold on Chuck's hand tightened. The doctor's words, "Your symptoms are consistent with early onset multiple sclerosis," hung in the air like a weight neither of them could bear. Emma's breath caught, and for a brief moment it felt like the ground had been torn out from under her. Chuck, though shaken, remained steady and turned to face her, his gaze unwavering. He said firmly, "You're not alone, Emma. You never will be." But the weeks that followed put them both to the test in ways they weren't prepared for. As her illness worsened, the ordinary things she had previously taken for granted turned into silent fights. And Emma, who was fiercely independent by nature, found it difficult to accept aid, even from Chuck. She detested feeling like a burden. Chuck, on the other hand, was kind and caring, but he was always concerned because he had previously lost so many people he loved. Would Emma be after a particularly trying day? Emma broke down the following evening. "I don't want you to feel trapped," she cried. She said in tears, "You didn't sign up for this, Chuck. I don't want to hold you back. You're not holding me back. You're giving me something I've never had before, a reason to fight, a reason to hope," Chuck said, kneeling in front of her and taking her hands in his. "Emma." Her tears fell more heavily, but this time they weren't just sad tears. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly seen and loved. As the months went by, they adjusted to their new reality. When Emma's health permitted, Chuck changed their schedule to prioritize time spent with her on film sets. They traveled together and found comfort in the quiet moments and the beauty of nature. Their story wasn't perfect or easy, but it was a testament to the human spirit's tenacity and the transformative power of love. Although the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was certain: they would face whatever came next together, hand in hand, one step at a time. As Chuck and Emma quietly learned to navigate the unknown, their love wasn't just a spark anymore. It was a fire that burned steadily, even in the face of darkness. There were times when Emma's body betrayed her so completely that she couldn't even get out of bed, but even in those moments Chuck remained by her side, steadfast and unwavering. One night when the rain continued to pour relentlessly against the windows of their small house near San Antonio, Emma woke up with tears streaming down her face. Chuck stirred instantly, sensing her anxiety and asking in a low but urgent voice, "What's wrong?" She gazed at him with heartbroken eyes, her voice shaking as she muttered, "I had a dream. I felt free as I walked on the beach, feeling the sand between my toes and the wind in my hair, just like I had before the accident. Chuck, I woke up feeling like I was alive, but I was unable to move my legs at all." Chuck didn't immediately answer, instead holding her while she sobbed. He was heartbroken by every SOB, and when she eventually CED, he kissed her forehead and murmured, "Emma, even though you are unable to walk that beach at this moment, I will still carry you as far as you desire to go because you are still here and alive." After packing a tiny bag and carrying her carefully to the car the following morning, Chuck shocked her by not answering her queries regarding their destination. Hours later, they arrived at a remote beach along the Gulf Coast, where the sun was sinking in stunning shades of pink and orange. Emma gazed at him bewildered. "Chuck, I can't even bear it." For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, she felt at peace as she whispered in a voice laced with defeat, and he smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He then scooped her into his arms and walked slowly onto the sand, where the ocean waves lapped at their feet, and she rested her head against his chest. The warmth of his unwavering love seemed to replace the weight of her illness, but life, as it so frequently does, wouldn't allow them to linger in peace for a long evening, just as Emma had started to become accustomed to her new normal. Chuck was completely taken aback when he got a call concerning his brother. Between Emma's deteriorating health and Aaron's health crisis, Chuck's world started to fall apart. He felt as though he was being torn apart, but he refused to let either of them see how scared he was. He divided his time between Emma's side and the hospital where Aaron was receiving treatment. His days were a blur of hospitals, sleepless nights, and quiet moments of desperation. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Emma noticed the strain in his eyes and the way his shoulders seemed to be bearing the weight of the globe. She whispered to Chuck, "You don't have to do this alone. Let me be there for you the way you've been there for me." He turned to face her, tears welling up in his eyes. "Emma, you're already fighting your own battle, so I can't ask you to take on mine too." She shook her head and smiled slightly, but she didn't ask Chuck. "That's what love is, isn't it? Carrying each other when the load gets too heavy," she said. And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to lean on her. They faced the storm together, finding strength in each other's company, even as their world seemed to fall apart around them. Then came the night that would change everything. Emma woke up in the middle of the night to find Chuck sitting on the floor by her bed, his head in his hands. She called softly, her voice barely audible, and he looked up, his face etched with a pain she had never seen before. "What is it?" she asked, her heart pounding. "I got a call, and he said," my voice cracking, "it's on the doctors. They don't think he has much time left." Emma's heart broke at the sight of him breaking down. She wanted nothing more than to hold him in her arms and take away his pain, but her body betrayed her once more. Instead, she reached for his hand and squeezed it, with all the strength she could muster, saying firmly, "Right now," and so they went. Aaron looked up as they entered Chuck, and he muttered, "You're here," in a weak but loving voice, while kneeling by his bedside and putting his hand in his. The hospital was silent when they arrived, with the hum of equipment filling the air. "Aaron, I'm always available." Emma silently promised herself and Chuck that she would fight with everything she had for as long as she could, so they could make memories like this together. But as the days turned into nights, and the nights into weeks, the weight of their struggles increased. Emma watched from her wheelchair, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the bond between them. The hospital room felt unbelievably quiet. Aaron's breathing was shallow, and his frailty struck Chuck in a way he wasn't prepared for as he sat by his side. Despite everything, Chuck never faltered. He stood by Emma's side during her darkest days, and she, in turn, gave him the strength to face his brother's battle. Aaron's weary eyes, filled with unspoken concerns and love, gazed up at him. Chuck said in a barely audible whisper, "You've always been the rock." Chuck grinned faintly, but his heart ached. "Aaron, you taught me that you battled harder than anyone I've ever known behind him." Although Emma understood that this moment wasn't hers to interrupt, she wanted to say something consoling as she sat quietly in her wheelchair and watched the affection between the siblings. Her presence alone, though, seemed to fill the room with warmth and tranquility, assurance that throughout the next few days, they were all in this together. Chuck divided his time between Aaron and Emma, balancing Emma's care and hospital trips with an apparent superhuman strength. But at a price, his sleepless nights started to show. The bags under his eyes darkened, and his once steady demeanor began to falter. One evening, Emma approached him as he was sitting on the side of their bed, his head lowered and his shoulders depressed. He gazed up at her, his black eyes full, with a tiredness that words couldn't express. "I can't stop, Emma. If I stop, I'm terrified I'll lose everything. I can't lose you. I can't lose an era." "Shaq," she started with a calm but firm voice. "You can't keep doing this. You're going to break." "You're not losing me," Emma whispered, wheeling herself closer and reaching out to hold his hand. Her voice was shaking, and no matter what happens, with Aaron you won't lose him either because he's a part of you, Chuck, and always will be. Her remarks resonated deeply with Chuck, and for the first time in weeks he let himself cry. Not the silent, controlled tears he was accustomed to releasing, but gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to release all the hurt he had been suppressing. The following morning they went to see Aaron together. He was weaker than before, his voice barely above a whisper. But when he saw Emma and Chuck enter the room, a faint smile appeared on his face. "You brought her," he whispered, his gaze softening as he looked at Emma. Emma held his hand tightly, her own tears streaming down as she whispered, "You don't have to carry this alone. Let me be your strength like you've been mine." As the days went by, they made the most of their time with AAR by sharing stories, laughing quietly, and just being there. Chuck brought Emma's wheelchair as close to Aaron's bedside as he could, and the two women found solace in each other's company, bonding over their shared love for the man who had been their rock through it all. However, even as they clung to these fleeting moments, the inevitable loomed over them like a shadow one night as Chuck. He was sitting by Aaron's bedside when his breathing became shallow and his hand became weaker. He whispered, barely audible, promise me, you'll keep living, don't let this stop you." Tears were streaming down his face as he nodded, his throat too tight to speak, "I promise." At last, he managed to crack his voice, "I promise, Ira." He smiled faintly, his eyes closing, and he whispered, "I love you, big brother." The silence that followed was deafening, and Chuck was gone. He buried his face in Emma's lap, his tears staining her dress as she caressed his hair. "He loved you so much, Chuck," Emma said as she wheeled herself closer and her arms reached out to him. In the weeks that followed, as the grief was overwhelming, Chuck threw himself into taking care of Emma in an attempt to divert his attention from the aching emptiness he had left behind. However, Emma saw right through him. She knew he was running, burying his pain in an effort to protect her. One night, as they sat together on their home's porch, Emma broke the silence. "He was so proud of you," Emma whispered. Chuck gazed into her eyes and said, "You must allow yourself to grieve. You cannot bear all of this alone. I'm so exhausted that I'm not sure how to let go." She grabbed his hand and held it firmly. "You don't have to let go. You may carry him with you in the same way that you carry all the people you've loved and lost. However, you must allow yourself to feel like Chuck and allow yourself to recover." Her comments stuck with him, and gradually he opened up. He talked about Aaron, their early years, his courage, his laughter, and his tears. Emma was there for him through all of it, supporting him at their darkest moments, but life had one more turn in store for them. Emma was unable to move her arms when she woke up one morning. He hurried to her side, his heart sinking as he saw the anguish in her eyes. "It's happening faster than I thought," and heard her whispered tears flowing down her face as she called out for Chuck, her voice shaking with fright. "I'm not sure how long I have left." When Chuck answered, "Then we'll make every second count." He crouched next to her and cupped her cheek. "Whatever time we have, Emma, we'll live it together." And they did. Chuck refused to allow her illness to define their life and organized little adventures. Excursions to the beach and peaceful picnics, even as her body deteriorated. Their love grew stronger under the stars as they watched old movies together. This is evidence of the human spirit's tenacity, but they both knew in their hearts that the future was uncertain, and even though they didn't express it out loud, they lived each day knowing that love, above all else, was what made life worthwhile. Chuck took Emma to the garden where her flowers were blooming. She asked him to pledge to live on after she died, and while he was devastated, he promised to grant her desire. When Emma passed away peacefully at dawn, Chuck's world was still destroyed. Years later, in that same garden, he smiled knowing their love remained alive in his heart forever, and he found comfort in tiny joys, acts of kindness, and the flower she loved.